So Dana White's Contender Series isn't coming up until about the halfway point of 2023, but about now is when I suspect that they're actually doing their scouting process, because in March of last year was when the first fights were announced for Dana White's Contender Series. So this is my list of middleweights that I think could be in Dana White's Contender Series 2023, or middleweights I think are eligible for it, and also just a good list of middleweight prospects to keep an eye on yourself. And as always, I thank you for everyone that's leaving comments about prospects that I may or may not have missed, and shout out to Aqualex, because Aqualex has left some really good ones. As always, I do have my 125% sign up bonus, but let's just move on. Colin Huckbody, he's the first one on the list because he's actually returning. He's been on Dana White's Contender Series before. He won in 90 seconds over Kyron Bowen, and then since then he hasn't been on like the perfect run, but he did lose to Aaron Jeffrey, who's a very, very good fighter. Dana White's Contender Series guy himself, and Johnny Eplin, who's currently the Bellator champion. I don't think there's too much shame in that. He's bounced back with a 2-fight win streak, and I think that Dana White's Contender Series should have him back. I think he's earned another spot. The next one is Vladimir Meniv. He's 16-1-1, very good. He seems to be a decent kickboxer as well, because he's got some kickboxing there. But man, in MMA has he got some good wins. We're talking about wins over 10-2, 16-4, 15-4, and 17-1, 17-2 opponents. Very, very good fighter. Vladimir Meniv, I'm not too sure what he's up to in MMA because he's doing kickboxing right now, but maybe he would be very, very good signing to UFC or Dana White's Contender Series. Eli Aronov, the Israeli tank, he's very good. He kind of came out of nowhere, you know what I mean? He fought Mariusz Kizilkiewicz. I believe it was a somewhat short notice fight that was made up. And Mariusz is a former Dana White's Contender Series guy himself. If Mariusz won that fight, he probably would have been signed to the UFC. And then Eli Aronov kind of dominated with the wrestling and grappling. And I think if he beats Injay La, 11-2 opponent, I think he's going to be in the UFC. So keep an eye out for Eli Aronov. Ryder Newman, he was on the Ultimate Fighter season 30, I believe it was, against Trayshawn Gore. Maybe it was season 29. But yeah, he fought on the Ultimate Fighter. He was only 3-1, but since then he's bounced back against good opponents, like a 3-1 opponent, a 14-4 opponent, and a 9-4 opponent. I think he's kind of earned himself another opportunity at getting into the UFC. He also trains out of Extreme Couture, which is a massive gym, and he's a lot more experienced now than he was when he was on the Ultimate Fighter. The next one is Nursultan Ruziboyev. Speaking of experienced fighters, we've got a guy with 44 professional fights. I found out about this guy. Someone is actually just spamming his Instagram in my chat, and he's got a pretty crazy following. He's got hundreds of thousands of followers on his Instagram, which is insane. He hasn't fought in a while. It seems like he struggles to find opponents, but he has beaten some pretty decent guys recently. A 15-2 opponent, a 13-4 opponent, a 12-12 opponent, but it looks like it was a fill-in for a short notice sort of fight. So he has beaten some good guys. He's beaten some not so great guys recently as well, but I don't know, maybe it could be worth a shot at getting Nursultan Ruziboyev into Dana White's Contender Series. Brogan Anderson, he's from New Zealand, he's 33 years old, and he is 15-3. He recently had a cancelled bout, and he seems to somewhat be struggling to find fights. I'm from New Zealand. There probably isn't really that many MMA fighters in New Zealand that are Brogan Anderson's level. He's on a massive win streak right now, hasn't lost in years, he hasn't really been fighting the best guys, but as I said, there's not really that many fighters around New Zealand, to be brutally honest, and he's looking really, really good. And he's beaten Mose Afawa, who went on a big win streak recently as well, and I think he's just got great grappling. I think he definitely has earned himself a shot at Dana White's Contender Series. Let's get more New Zealanders in the UFC. I think there's only like 5 or 6 of us, so let's get some more in there. Lucas Fernando, who's 8-1, he's actually going to be headlining an LFA card, which is going to be pretty massive. And usually what happens is, if you win an LFA bout, you pretty much just get signed straight to the UFC, or you get on Dana White's Contender Series. It's pretty much just a given at this point. So, yeah, I think that's going to happen. He's also beaten some very good opponents as well. He did lose in 2020, but he bounced back against a 4-0 opponent, a 7-2 opponent, an 18-3 opponent. Now he's fighting an 8-2 Yancey Silva, who's a good prospect himself. Chad Hanekom, he's from South Africa. I do believe we're going to see more South African fighters signed to the UFC kind of around soon-ish, because I believe that UFC, once they can really build up Cameron Simon, who's got a pretty big fan base, and also people like Dricus du Plessis, and maybe they can start signing more South African fighters, get into that market. Africa is a pretty big continent. I mean, I'm a geography genius with that one, but there's definitely a market to be made there, and there's a lot of really good up-and-coming African fighters that not a lot of people are covering, and Chad Hanekom is one of those guys that is coming up, and he just recently destroyed Anjay La in 90 seconds, who was an 11-1 South Korean opponent over at Brave CF. He's looking pretty good, you know what I mean? He's got a win over Leon Aliyu, who was on Dana White's Contender Series last year, and he lost to Bruno Ferreira. And Bruno Ferreira just beat Gregory Rodriguez, who's like a borderline top 15 guy. He's got a split decision loss to Ikram Alaskirov. You know, do I have to keep going? Ikram Alaskirov's in the UFC now. He's absolutely insane. Yeah, I think Chad Hanekom's legit, and he's gonna do some good things, I think. Akhmed Salamov, maybe a little bit too inexperienced, but that's what Dana White's Contender Series is for. He's 5-1. He represents France. UFC's trying to sign more fighters from France, although he was born in Russia. He seems to represent France on Stepology, but either way, he's fighting at Ares FC. He beat a 6-2 opponent and a 5-0 opponent in the first round. I mean, he's a pretty good fighter. Maybe you've got to give him a little bit more time, but he is 29 years old. So if we give this guy another year, he's going to be 30, and he's going to be a little bit too old to maybe spend the time pushing him as a prospect in the UFC. So maybe now is the kind of good time to get him on Dana White's Contender Series, get him a little bit more experienced, maybe put him on the Paris card if he's training out at MMA Factory in France, because he's pretty good. Will Curry, he's only 24 years old, he's 9-2, and he's from England. UFC obviously trying to tap into that European market. His 2 losses actually happened to come to Christian Leroy Duncan. I believe the first fight, he thought it was an early stoppage, so they fought again, and Christian Leroy Duncan beat him again. But since then, he's bounced back with some pretty good wins. I mean, 5-1, 3-1, 12-2 opponents, but at the end of the day, like, he's a good prospect. He's a young guy. I think he's going to have a good career. Christian Leroy Duncan was on this list, but he just got signed to the UFC, so he's no longer on the list. And he's also got a big debut scheduled coming up too, but unfortunately, I forgot who it was against. But thankfully, Tapology is such a good website. I can just do this and it will tell me. Dusko Todorovic, I think everyone kind of knows what's going to happen there. Christian Leroy Duncan's going to get a highlight reel knockout, so good for him. The next one here is Marco Tulio Silva. I left that fight screen open, unfortunately. I think this guy is going to be a fun fighter in the UFC. I think he's going to get past his LFA opponent here in Well Oliveira, and I think he's definitely going to be on Dana White's Contender Series. Usually guys from really big gyms are, and he fights from Shootbox Diego Lima. Shootbox guys are just awesome to watch. They're super out there, like Daniel Silva, Charles Oliveira, Luan Lacerda. I guess it wasn't really that exciting of a fight, but Daniel Santos, like, we're talking about very, very exciting fighters from Shootbox. And I think Marco Tulio Silva's going to fit in then. And if you're in a big gym, I find that if you're fighting out of a big gym, you've got a pretty good chance of being on Dana White's Contender Series. Because last year, some random 6-1 dude that hadn't fought in like over 3 years just ended up on Dana White's Contender Series. It was super weird. Like, even like Daniel Marcos as well hadn't fought for over 3 years, and he was on Dana White's Contender Series. It was an interesting time, but you know what I mean. The bigger the gym, the probably the more the UFC knows you. The gym's pushing you to the UFC, this and that. We move on. Daniel Compton, 8-2. He is from the United States. He's a little bit older, to be fair, to maybe call a prospect. He's 34 years old. But the reason why he's on this list is because he just got a very legitimate win over Marky Patolo. And a win over Billy Alocana is pretty good too, because he's an up-and-coming guy. But it was the Marky Patolo win that's quite a good one, because Marky Patolo, if you guys don't know, he was in the UFC very recently, actually in 2021, and then in 2022 he was making a run to get back into the UFC. He beat a veteran guy by decision, and then he knocked out Doug Archer, who was 13-3 in 30 seconds. And maybe if he beat Daniel Compton, he probably would have maybe been called back up on short notice or something like that. But the point is, Marky Patolo, a guy that was in the UFC very recently, and Daniel Compton just beat him. So maybe he should go on Dana White's Contender Series. I know he's an older guy, but he's definitely still got a lot to give. So I think Daniel Compton deserves a shot. Valentin Woodburn, he's 7-0. He represents Jamaica. We don't have too many fighters at the top now representing Jamaica. I know Uriah Hall did. I believe Aljamain Sterling does as well. But we've got an up and coming 7-0 guy here. He hasn't fought like like too much. Wait, what was I trying to say? He's fought a lot recently. Like he's been super active. He made his pro debut in 2020, so all 7 of his wins have come in the last 3 years. So he's been active and he's beaten good guys too. 17-8, 13-16. Very experienced guys, and before that he was beating some up and coming dudes himself. So yeah, Valentin Woodburn, 7-0 guy. Maybe it could be worth giving him a shot. Salamu Abdurakhmanov, obviously you've just got to do it. You've got to put on these Russian guys that are absolutely insane. The 14-1 Salamu here, he's got some good wins. He is signed to ACA, so maybe he's on an exclusive contract. Maybe he won't be able to be on Dana White's Contender Series or the UFC. He's got a win over a 10-0 opponent, a 15-1 opponent. Do I need to go on? Very, very good fighter. The next one, same situation. He may not have the prettiest record in the world, but he's 16-8. I don't believe he's going to be signed to an exclusive contract because it doesn't look like he's fighting for major promotions. But he just beat the 15-0 Shamil Ramazanov by finish in the 4th round. He's also got a win over an 8-1 opponent. He's got a win over a 17-5 opponent, 18-7 opponent. I feel like what happened here was Hardcore FC signed him with a somewhat not so great record, like he was 10-8, and they're like, alright, we'll test you, we'll test this other guy against you who's 1-0. He passed that test, Dimitri did, and then they were going to maybe try and get this Tagir guy a win, because he's 2-0. It's like, alright, we need to step up the competitions. He's an 8-1 prospect. He beat him in the 1st round. They're like, okay, you're beating all of our prospects, we need to punish you a little bit. He's at 15-0 Shamil Ramazanov, and then he beats him, so I feel like that was probably what was going on. They're like, Dimitri was maybe signed to at 10-8, by the way. Like, it's not a very pretty record to maybe build up other guys. He just beat them all, especially the 15-0 Shamil. So, yeah, Dimitri, I think he's kind of proven himself to be a very good, solid fighter. So I think we give him a good shot in Dana White's Contender Series. Not the prettiest record, but he's showing that he can beat some top-level dudes, man. Faridun Odilov, he's from Tajikistan. He's 14-2-2. A very good fighter, middleweight, struggling to find opponents. It seems he's fighting an ACA, so once again, maybe he's got a exclusive contract. One of his losses just happens to be against Shavkat Rakhmonov in 2018. You know what I mean? Like, it's not a bad loss, and since then he's gone on a very nice, tidy win streak over some good guys: 6-1, 26-10, 6-2, 7-4, 16-6. I don't know, man. I think this guy's pretty good. Faridun Odilov, good record too. Insu Huang, he's 6-1. He's from South Korea. UFC needs more South Korean fighters. They couldn't put on that event in South Korea. His only loss was like a 5-second knockout, and just unfortunately, those sort of things kind of happen when you fight like he does. Almost all of his wins are first round finishes by KO because he runs forward and tries to get KOs. But unfortunately, against Won Jin Choi, he just got countered and knocked out immediately. But those things happen, man. So yeah, I think this is a pretty solid list. Obviously, I would have missed some people, but let me know what you think in the comments. I would appreciate that, and I'll see you in the next video. It'll probably be UFC 284 early predictions, man. Like, these early predictions videos are fun to make. They're easy to make. I was going to do LFA 151 predictions, but I just don't really know the fighters that well, and I'm tired, man. Like, I know it's Tuesday, but work is hard, and I just don't have the time to watch tape on every LFA fighter, you know what I mean? It's just kind of, yeah, it's just kind of a bit of a mission. But if you really want to know who I think's going to win, I think Yulia Pilastri wins, and I also think Jose Delano wins as well. Aside from that, it's pretty much a toss-up with a lot of these really good prospects. I think Jonas Bernharano wins. I think Milson Castro wins. He was actually meant to fight a UFC fighter, former UFC fighter, but they must have fallen out anyway. Yeah, Roosevelt Roberts, he was meant to fight. But anyway, yeah, I'll leave you in the next one. I think this is going to be a great fight night card.